A pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater. Hi, I'm Father Andrew Miller.
And I'm Reverend Michelle Byerly.
And this is A Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater, a podcast about faith, life, and the silver screen. Today we'll be discussing the 1995 drama film, The American President.
For those of you who have not seen it, we recommend that you do, as we'll be getting into spoilers, themes, conversations. It is fantastic, and we really encourage you to watch it. It was written by Aaron Sorkin and directed by Rob Reiner. So, as we get started, let's jump right in.
In the pre conversation, you mentioned that it was essentially the unofficial pilot episode of The West Wing, which is another television show written by Aaron Sorkin, which is more about the institution and doesn't really include the president having a romance. But I think it's safe to say that both Pastor Michelle and I are wing nuts in the sense that we both enjoy that show. I'd never seen The American President all the way through until a few days ago, but I had seen The West Wing all the way, like all the episodes of The West Wing. Gotta admit, I think The West Wing is better.
I would have to agree, partly because it deals with a lot more topics over the course of the time, and it's a lot less focused on the president versus The West Wing does kind of look more at the workings of the staff, which is kind of what it was intended to be. Mm-hmm. Even though it does kind of eventually, Martin Sheen's a force.
Oh, yeah.
And so when he becomes the president in that series, but for today we get Michael Douglas as president, and he's absolutely a fine tradition as far as actors go. So one of the first big themes that I talked about with this movie was this concept of the life in a fishbowl. One of the big questions of the movie is whether it is okay for a president to date while in the White House. And as someone who is in a role that is also rather public, I have thought about that many a time of, what it looks like if your pastor is dating or gets married. I have seen clergy who have gotten married in the course of being in one appointment and how that changes the relationship that they have with their parishioners. And so, it struck me there's a line in there about, do I have to check a poll to say it's okay to date?
Well, yeah. Although I would push back a little bit on President, what's his name, Shepard, in the following way. It's not, I guess I have a similar critique of Bill Clinton in that it's not so much that it's the dating and having a private life that I have a problem with, as it is the power differential between yourself and this lobbyist, between Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, right? That to me is the real scandal there in both cases. And it really, I think, isn't to the movie's discredit, it isn't really talked about that much. It's talked about as a scandal in the sense of it being somehow obscene for the president to have a girlfriend, a bachelor to have a girlfriend. And of course, Monica Lewinsky, that scandal was talked about as if it was obscene, well, and the lying, but it was obscene for the president to have a girlfriend outside of marriage, and to do so in the Oval Office and all of that. But to me, that's not the issue. The issue is power differential. The president of the United States is arguably the most powerful person on the planet. And the woman he's dating, the woman he's married to, is not. And how do we negotiate? And that's part of why, I think it's perfectly fine for clergy to date, but is it perfectly fine for clergy to date their own parishioners?
That is the big no-no. And that's the distinction. Mm-hmm. And I would agree. One issue that I do have with this is that it plays around with, I think overall they try to make Sydney's character, who's played by Annette Bening, they do try to make her very intelligent. They do try to give her, for goodness sake, she does stand up and is critiquing the president in his own space, but then you notice he turns right around and he puts her back on his turf in the Oval Office. And what I don't like is that they almost, yes, she's this brilliant, intelligent, wise person, but she almost becomes the butt of jokes at times.
Yes,
And that frustrates me.
well, the litany of people coming in and say, "Hey, Sydney, Mr. President, we got to talk about." What frustrates me is that every time the president invites her to something, she turns into this bubbly fangirl. I mean, I think it's sort of like Top Gun and Days of Thunder. They nominally make the lead lady intelligent, professional woman, and yet somehow they can't get away from also turning her into this bubbling fangirl, right? That she's not intelligent enough to realize boundaries and to realize power differential. And I guess that's my real problem with how they did Sydney's character.
I would agree. I mean, and I guess, I just had a thought. I'm rating this on the Bechdel test, and I don't think it quite passes because, yes, Lucy Shepherd and her talk,
Mm-hmm.
but they talk about the president and they talk
Right.
about what he's doing and that kind of thing. Although I do like the relationship that they start to develop. They just are getting to know one another. And
Well, there was an opportunity for Aaron Sorkin to write conflict in there that he elected not to write. The conflict between the kid and the new mother figure. That's often a theme in stories. And in fact, Lucy likes Sydney in the film.
yeah.
I did want to mention, though, I mean, laying aside the power differentials, which is what the film does, it still asks a good question. To what extent do people whose very person um, is claimed by the community, to what extent do they get to have a private life? Because, and it might be easier in a country like Great Britain, where the head of government, there's a difference between the head of government and the head of state. Prime Minister is the head of government, but the Queen is the head of state. Prime Minister gets to have more of a private life. The Queen does not, right? Whereas in our country, the two roles are combined. The president is both the head of government and the head of state. But I suppose to what extent also, and this gets into our conversation about iconography, to what extent is the very person of a head of state, which constitutes a kind of incarnation of the body politic, a kind of incarnation of the country itself, which is how the royal family in Britain performs, which is how the presidency in the United States performs. To what extent is that an idol that really needs to go away in general? That there really
Oh,
shouldn't
definitely.
be a head of state. There should just be a head of government, an administrative head of the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so I'm actually going to quote I can't give you chapter and verse on this, but I can tell you the story.
Mm-hmm.
So before there were kings for the people of Israel, they begged, they begged, they begged. And God and God always said, "No, you don't need a king. You don't need a king." And they had a run with kings. They had some that were better than others, some that were not. But I think you're right that there is part of that goes back to that idea of it does sort of become this idol, this language that we create, and I think it's kind of there's a difference even between what is celebrity versus what is the accountability that one holds as a head of state, because there is certainly, again, I keep coming back to my own example of being a pastor. I recognize that there is some level to which, no, I don't always have the right to privacy in ways that others do. I get that part of stepping into the role that I have stepped into is that I've committed to being an example to my congregation, that I've agreed to live with some level of moral standings. Now we can debate and argue what that is or not. But I knew that getting into it. I think that when you're running for office, And I think to an extent we do create kind of a persona that's a public persona versus a private persona. For me, I like the quote that I think of from To Kill a Mockingbird is that Atticus Finch is the same person that you see in public versus what you see at home. Mm-hmm. And I've always tried to live by that, where both who I am in front of people and who I am behind the scenes, I try to have an integrity there.
Yeah.
Frankly, because I don't have the energy to pretend one way or the other. You know?
Well, the way that, oh my God, Father Andrew is going to talk about Karl Marx again. When our lives in our workplace are so, when we approach our daily life with such estrangement and alienation, the next human move is to project fulfillment onto other entities. Right. So we create a God figure. Now, I happen to think that there is a real God, but we do create a God figure and project perfection and project fulfillment onto that God figure and worship it. To me, that the cult of the celebrity and the cult of the head of state is really just the same phenomenon, right? This thing called the nation state, this thing called the government is so alien to me. I minored in political science, and even I still don't get it. Right? It's so many moving parts. It's so exploitative. And yet, so what I do is I create this ideology in my head and I project onto the person of the president of the United States the best that I want to see in myself and the best that I want to see in my country. But the problem is that the president of the United States, he's a human. He's a human being.
Right.
And so that not only is idolatrous, and it's also abusive. It's abusive to the celebrities and the president. It's abusive to the people that we do this to. And no wonder there's so much scandal in these worlds. There's so much scandal because when these people inevitably demonstrate that, oh my God, they're human beings, they aren't always the projection of perfection that they try to project themselves as. We jump on them in part because what it represents is a failure of us. If they can't be what we need them to be, then it just reminds us of how fucking estranged and alienated and exploited we are. And then the whole system of us avoiding our alienation and escaping from our estrangement just collapses in on itself.
Well, and I wonder, is there a difference if there's a leader who is willing to get on screen and say, hey, I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to make mistakes here. Bear with me. We'll try to work together. Is that a different thing than someone who tries to set themselves up to be this moral paragon?
I would want that, I suppose, in an ideal world. And, it's interesting in the Blessed Lunatics episode, we were talking, the aspect of the Marxist texts that Wesley picked up on in the Blessed Lunatics episode. Wesley, just go ahead and cut this if you don't want me telling your story, is the idea of the dissolution of the state. Right. And Marx believes that the state dissolves as class conflict dissolves, because the whole point of the state is to manage class conflict. Well, Wesley had kind of a counter interpretation of that, where he believed that actually the state turns into just an administrative body. Right. And I find a parallel in that to the head of state becomes a kind of head of government. My answer to your question would be if and only if this person is just trying to be a head of government to fulfill a necessary administrative role. And that to me is the only real honest way to do it.
Yeah.
Because that avoids the projection.
Yeah. So,
I think I'd like to transition, if I may, into this idea of iconography, and then talk about sort of patriotism as the freedom to kind of shit on the icons. Because, and I find that
Sure.
very interesting. It's very interesting that you pointed this out, that the film begins with very, very flowery patriotic music that continues throughout the course of the film, and with sort of a camera going all through these icons of presidents, and these icons of the Constitution and the flag and American symbols. Of course, the title of the film is The American President, right?
Yeah, and portraits of former famous former presidents is also part of that milieu that it shows.
And yet it also kind of shits on them. It believes in them. And Aaron Sorkin, I know a little bit about Aaron Sorkin as a person. Aaron Sorkin is very much so a believer in the American story, and a patriot, albeit a liberal patriot, a Democrat. He's a Democrat. But the film shits on them in the following way, in that, well, Annette Bening's character is a left-wing activist, and participated in a flag burning. And, well, part of the conflict there is the Republican candidate for president is using that to his advantage to score political points against the president. And the president, in the last speech of the film, sort of says, doubles down on it. And no, patriotism is about dissent. Yes, we have all of these wonderful icons, but part of what is special about the American story, although I'm not really sure that it is special about the American story, but we'll tell the myth and then we'll critique it, is that the American story, at the very heart of our law, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is the ability to dissent, the ability to, in some sense, take the icons and shit on them, and then, in an oddly ironic twist, it is the act of shitting on them that becomes the greatest act of patriotism, the greatest act of honoring what they are really about. And the tone in my voice is reflecting a kind of patriotism in me, because this is a story that I very much so want to believe in. I desperately want to believe in. But I met, when I was a teenager, I got to meet a B-2 bomber pilot, and who was flying sorties in, we'll create another one, another meeting, who was flying sorties over Iraq, right? Because I'm from Missouri, and Whiteman Air Force Base in central Missouri is the headquarters of the B-50 or the B-2 stealth bomber, and he was flying sorties over Iraq, and he was asked by one of the Republican kids at Boys State, did he feel, and it was a leading question, did he feel insulted by all of these war protesters? And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "No, I feel honored by these war protesters, because they are who I am fighting for." And I cried. I thought that was really, although I don't actually think that's what he was fighting for, but he might have thought that he was fighting for them. But no, the ability to do that is exactly what I'm fighting for.
Yeah.
So
yeah, so it's funny. A little side story, and we can delete it later if we find it's not relevant. I went to Girls State, and I would say at that time I was a lot more of what I might consider a dogmatic patriot. Mm-hmm. Whereas now I see a lot more of the nuance in it. I see a lot more of the, it's just I am not a nationalist. I'm a patriot. Mm-hmm. And there's a big difference. I love the line from the movie. The symbol of patriotism and of this country cannot just be a flag. It has to be the ability to then stand on that flag, burn it, and don't get me wrong, I think symbols have power, and there is something, to me, I would still cringe when I saw someone doing that, but you'd be darn right that I'd be protecting them. I'd be making sure that their civil rights were being protected while they were doing it, because that is their First Amendment right to protest. And if I want to keep mine, I'm going to fight for theirs.
What is the difference between patriotism and nationalism?
So for me, nationalism is the love of the image. It's the love of that idol. Whereas, and it's uncriticizing, it's just getting sucked into the narrative. Whereas true patriotism is being able to understand, yes, there is the story that we've created. Here's also the parts of the story that we don't like to tell, but that are part of our story, and owning that part just as much. And to say that it's a patriotic thing to critique something and still love it. That it's being able to say, I still love my country. I still hold my US citizenship. I still hold that passport, and I feel the power of that. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to say, I have issues with what happened on January 6th, or I have issues with the way that certain leaders have played the system for their own political gain. It doesn't have to be this unflinching, uncriticizing love of the idol. You have to be able to love the thing for all of its warts and all of what it is.
Yeah, it seems to me there are two parts of the American story, and there's the story that the icons tell, and then there's the story that, as you say, we don't like to talk about. And I don't think either the left or the right, broadly defined, has really come to terms with what to do with those aspects of the American story, like the fact that we are a settler colonial nation, the fact that we exist on stolen land, the fact that we are responsible for genocide, responsible for slavery, and all of this is our original sin, and all of this is as American as apple pie. And yet the story that the icons tell is that we are a democratic republic geared toward maximizing civil liberty, freedom, whatever the hell that means, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all of that poetry, right? The prose of governing and the reality of our existence is that we have not, from the very beginning, lived up to the poetry of who we supposedly claim to be, and even the very people who are writing that poetry were not living into. They own slaves, for God's sakes, and yet there are those on the left, many of my comrades in the party, who would say that what all of this means is that there really is no room for the American story anymore. We need to tell a new story. And it's not possible for the United States as such to become socialist, to become a just society, if you don't want to use the term socialist. I'd like to disagree with them. I really would, and I think I do, but I don't know. I'm not sure that the constitutional tradition that we've built, for better and worse, can survive the coming of God's justice.
Yeah. And I think that is the thing that you've hit on. What do we have to break down and let die so that resurrection can happen?
Yeah. Well, Aaron Sorkin would strongly disagree with me. And if Aaron Sorkin, his works in The American President and in West Wing and in others of his works, especially The Newsroom, which if you haven't seen parts of that there's some quite very interesting bits and pieces in The Newsroom. Aaron Sorkin has a definite ideology when it comes to who this country is and what his beliefs are. He is a firm believer that the American story is a good story, and in spite of its flaws, needs to be cultivated and perfected. And I think the part of the reason why I like The West Wing so much is because I would like to be too. I don't know, but I would like to be. I would like to believe.
Yeah. I mean, my thing about, and maybe it's just because those shows, this movie and The West Wing, came out of a different era of politics, I'm a lot more cynical. I don't think we can get there with where we're at now. I think I cannot see, it used to be, okay, we have our perspectives, let's have a debate about the issues. Great. And then we move on together. That's not how it works anymore. Or at least I'm cynical enough to think that's not how it works anymore. That anymore, what I see is a grasp for power. It's a grasp for, I would rather you suffer just so that I'm right versus I may not agree with you, but I'm going to at least make sure that we're taking care of each other.
There was an article written in 2018 entitled "The Cruelty is the Point," with Donald Trump and his supporters. Cruelty was the point.
Yeah, like I remember that.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I think Trump's appeal was that Trump appealed to a kind of base cruelty in the body politic of the United States and writ large, that we want to see our enemies suffer. And to some extent, well, I think what you're touching on is that to some extent, we'd rather see our enemies suffer than get what we want. Because I think none of the people that Trump appealed to, middle class people, farmers especially, they were not better off because of his policies. They were worse off, especially his trade policies did not benefit farmers at all. They still voted for him, and I think that's because the cruelty was the point. Your point about going back to this sense of a time in which politics is about compromise instead of power. I'd like to push back a little bit, if I may.
Sure.
So I wonder if it was ever the case that politics, especially US politics, but politics more generally, was about compromise and discussion. Has it always really been about power? I mean, what has changed?
That's a very fair point.
Well, I mean, what has changed, I think, since the Trump era, and actually, I think this might be to Trump's credit, in fact, is that the notion that politics is about power is, in fact, more naked now. There's a scripture in Second Thessalonians 2:3, that talks about how the second coming will not occur until a falling away occurs and the person of sin be revealed for who they are. In other words, and I think that nowadays, and I think this is painful, but it might actually be a good thing, that the different strains in American politics, left and right, have been revealed for who they are. There's no way we can deny that the right is fascistic. We can't deny that anymore. They can't hide behind stately conversations and compromise and political, the values of political discussions anymore. They are revealed for who they are, as are we. And that's my critique of American Sorkin and of Aaron Sorkin and Sorkinite liberalism in The West Wing, The American President, in the Newsroom, etc. Because to me, it calls us back to a time that really didn't exist. And in that sense, it calls us back to a lie. And in that sense, I think it's really more hurtful than helpful. I mean, you remember that scene from The Newsroom that was shared on social media that shocked us all when Jeff Daniels' character said, "It's not the greatest country in the world." And went through all the statistics, and he's right, by the way, like all the statistics, how the United States was, not leading in education and in all of that, except military spending, we lead there. But and then he said something that really grinds my gears. But we were the greatest country in the world because we were informed. And it's like, first off, no, we weren't. Even then, you're taking us back to the 1950s, and you want to talk about the 1950s and how horrid they were for people who didn't have access to the to the American dream, like blacks. Second off, how ethnocentric is it to claim that there is such a thing as the greatest country in the world? That's such bullshit. And then finally, we talked about the survival of the United States, the survival in the face of God's justice. And to pull a little bit from James Cone, the great theologian, Black liberation theologian, I think that whether or not we get to survive as a national identity gets to be decided by those on whose backs our national identity has been built. If Native Americans and Blacks decree a death sentence for the United States and determine that something new on this continent has to be created, then if we as US citizens are truly redeemed in Christ, our response must not be defensive, but rather it must be, and now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace as thou hast promised. For these eyes have seen the salvation which you have prepared for all the world to see, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. Amen.
I would agree.
Thanks for
And
letting
I
me
think,
go on that diatribe.
yeah. Well, and here's the thing. Again, it decentralizes power from the powerful to those who have historically been kept out of access to power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and to be fair, we the Iroquois League, there's a lot that we have drawn on when we came to this country, especially among the early England settlers, among others. So that's not to say that there weren't places of power, but we have basically come in and trampled that. And so, that to me, the fundamental grind is still the fact that we have had 46 presidents now, and ostensibly only one has been non-white male European. We've still got all male. So, that's my own bugaboo, but, there's still these places where whose narrative, right? And this gets back to that idolatry or the narrative of American exceptionalism that you were getting at. It's who gets to tell the story. And I even think about that with that, there's the line in Hamilton where one of the big issues is who lives, who dies, who tells your story. And so what is the story that we're telling ourselves about what it means to be American, to be the president? I over the last 30 years, and especially within the last few for myself, I want to go back to this idea of letting the president be human and recognizing, like the president doesn't control gas prices. The president doesn't control inflation. The president, I mean, there's so many things, we have this narrative about what we think the president can do that really they can't. And yes, of course, the president can exercise influence, can say a word or two. For me, I think about one of the harder parts of this movie was the part where the president has a choice where he can either do what's going to politically get him what he wants, or he can do what he knows is right, but it means, or he can do what he wants politically, but it means betraying someone, or he can have the courage to stand up. And I think for me, I'm sorry if I'm going off on my own rant here, I get so frustrated with the politics that says, well, we can't do that because we're not going to get anywhere with it. It's just a non-starter. And it's like, but dude, if you just tried and you were worried, my thing is we get so focused on, and I love the thing I love the most about the speech at the end is that line where he says, I'm Andrew Shepard and I am the president. And what that means is there is very much a difference between running for office and being in office. And to me, the problem is that we have blurred that line where people always, in order to stay in office, it's like they have to continue to be running for it instead of just doing the job that they were sent there to do. Because I think about how many things we could do if we weren't so worried about what that meant for being able to run again. And it's sad because, I get the political expediency, right? I get that you can only do good if you win and can stay. But it's like, if you would just do what you said you would do, you might actually get people to vote for you.
There's a sense in which, the line that I keep coming to is you got to fight the battles you can win. I don't remember what the line was. Is that where he challenges that? There's like you got to fight the battles you can fight or something. I don't remember, but anyway, it strikes there's there's some thinking on the left to that point, where some of us really question our allegiance to the Democratic Party, right? I, for one, I am a Democrat because to me it's a relationship of convenience, and to it's a very pragmatic thing to be a Democrat for me. If you to know you cannot win political fights if you are not either a Democrat or a Republican. That is the reality. But there are a lot of people on the far left who, following that line of reasoning of, well, why don't we just do what it is we believe instead of compromising? The result is they play politics where they can outside of the party and refuse to have anything to do with the Democratic Party, or with their comrades who have anything to do with the Democratic Party. And I don't mention that by way of disagreeing with you, Michelle. I mention that by way of saying that there is a real tension there that I think is unresolved.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a tension of, there's still good that we have to get done.
Mm-hmm.
How can we do that? And to recognize that there are times when you're not going to get everything you want. But the problem, particularly on the left, is we will do too much compromising, but then that means that we're playing the fundamentalist game.
There's a sense in which, I mean, this is another critique I have of Aaron Sorkin and his ideas, is that both The West Wing and this movie have this idea that if you just work hard enough, and how connected to the American to American ideology is this? If you just work hard enough and argue your point well enough, you can win and get your way. There's so many episodes of The West Wing where that is true, and it's like, that is not how politics works.
Yeah,
I wish it were. It's part of the reason why I love The West Wing so much, is because I want to live in that world where liberalism works, where people of conscience, usually men of conscience, in Sorkin's world, where people of conscience fight hard and win. And they're fighting against other people of conscience who just happen to be on the other side. And they fight hard and they win. But the underbelly of that is people who don't have houses, people who don't have food. Because, yeah, Bartlett is a great man, but there's still a lot of homeless people in Bartlett's America. And where do they fit in? And there's still a lot of blacks who don't have access to the American dream in Bartlett's America. And I'm not convinced that the dream of Aaron Sorkin is a dream that's worth a damn. Yeah. That's my second diatribe. Sorry, you want to go in another diatribe?
No, so another theme that I think is interesting as it plays out in this movie is the relationship between Sydney and Lucy, where Lucy's the president's daughter. Underneath all of this is that this president has lost his wife to cancer, Lucy's mother. And I find it really interesting, the relationship dynamics that play out between the president and his daughter, and Sydney and his daughter, as the president and Sydney are getting together. The first time that they meet, she's very polite. She's seems excited. She's willing to go along to an extent with her dad to make him seem like a normal person.
She even gives him advice.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Compliment her shoes. Girls like that.
Yeah. So, but then there's also this element of, there's still some unspoken work there. Back to the life in the fishbowl. It's very hard to be the daughter of a president because everything you do is scrutinized. It's a little bit like being a pastor's kid, which I never had that experience, but it's definitely the truth. That your pastor's family is very much scrutinized and better behave certain way, dress a certain way, think a certain way. And the way that this plays out in this movie is she has trouble with social studies, but she won't say why. And at first I thought it was more just I have to deal with this all the time because my dad's president. But I think it's really that, from what I understand, is that she doesn't want to do anything that's going to reflect badly on her dad. She doesn't feel like she can say the things that she wants to say or do the things that she wants to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. She doesn't feel, and Lucy's character, I feel they could have done so much more with. Because she does, and I wonder if that's sort of the hint in the script of the film there, that the character of Lucy, because I when I saw the film, you caught this and I didn't. When I saw the film, I just kind of dismissed Lucy as a character. Oh, she's the daughter who happens to like her dad's girlfriend. But it seems to me that her character is the one who doesn't get to say what she wants to say.
Well, and here's the other side of this that I just realized. Sorry to interrupt. Nope. Part of the critique that is made around this relationship with Sydney is that he's right down the hall while they're having this relationship, as if that makes a dang bit of difference.
What, you mean your parents don't have sex? I mean,
right. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, why does this, and it's all an assumption about we've got to protect our children
from sex.
Yeah.
Because sex is bad.
Yeah. I mean, and to be fair, I agree with the notion of being careful when you're dating as a single parent. I can understand being careful about who you introduce your children to. But to me, in this case, I wouldn't worry about that so much.
Well, it gets to is the problem personality or is the problem obscenity?
Yeah.
Right? Because and that's part of it. I mean, what is the statement from 1 Samuel, the 16th chapter? Is the human beings look on the outer shell, whereas the Lord looks on the heart of the matter. And it's like, look, obscenity. I think the entire idea of obscenity is bullshit. It's like sex happens. We're sexual beings. It's who we are, and that's fine. But by being so obsessed with sex as this thing that is dirty, unless inoculated by this thing called marriage, we miss out on so many real problems. Like, for instance, the real problem of the film, I mean, the film itself missed out on this. The real problem of their relationship isn't the fact that they're having sex. The problem is the power differential. I mean, the problem is not that as a parent, as a single parent, you're having sex with your boyfriend while your child is down the hall. The problem is, who is your boyfriend? Is this a good person? Is this a person who's going to care for your child, or is this a person who is exploitative and abusive? And that's why we miss consent, right? That's why we miss the doctrine of positive consent, because we're so caught up on saying that we should never ever have sex unless we're married, that we miss the ethics of sex when we're not. The doctrine of positive consent.
Yeah. Well, and I still, looking back on, you mentioned the Clinton scandal earlier. I know people who still hold it against Hillary that she decided to stay. And it's like, who the flip cares? That is her decision to make between her and Bill, for
Yes,
right or for wrong.
I have no doubt. I think Bill Clinton was a sexual predator,
Yeah.
and there have been a lot of circumstances which have demonstrated that.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that you can blame Hillary for that is, well, it's absurd.
Well, and it's not so much that they blame her, it's that they think she should have left. And I'm like, it's up to her to decide that.
Mm-hmm. It's her marriage.
Yeah. So, but I mean, all of this gets back. You made me think about the certain roles and how, do we view that, as a president, you either project this idea of a perfect marriage, everything's all happy, or you project being a single president, but who's essentially asexual, mm-hmm. which is like, that's just plain gullibility, mm-hmm. to quote a movie of ours. Dogma. And so, how we view people as sexual or non-sexual beings, and whether does that matter for the job that they're doing.
Well, and I guess part of the reason why I like The West Wing so much better is because the way the West Wing focuses in on politics, right? And so sex is there, but it's there. It's just part of it. It's part of the human experience. Whereas here, in this film, I mean, why couldn't they have just made a film about politics? Why did they have to pull in romance and sex and the taboo of the president dating? To me, it would have been a far more interesting movie had they actually made a movie that was essentially The West Wing, right? And in doing so, I think it plays into this note. I think it tries to critique this sort of sexual puritanism that we suffer from as in our culture, but I don't think it does a very good job of it. But I think it plays into this idea of sex as something that is set apart and taboo and.
Well, and sorry, I thought I had earlier that I'm picking back up. Another issue with the whole Bill Clinton thing that people made such a big deal of was that it was in the Oval Office and that it was treated like this violation of a sacred space, which gets back to our conversation around iconoclasm and building icons, building idols. And I think, for me, that was the part that I really had to check myself on after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, was that there was a lot of this language of desecration and violation. And I had to kind of catch myself. I'm like, this isn't a sacred, I mean, it is, but it isn't.
That's a question, I think.
I mean, isn't that interesting how, yes, I cringed and I got so angry at the fact that there was a Confederate flag that was took through the Capitol, which had not even happened during the Civil War, and so, and it did feel like there was this violation of something that should be quasi-sacred. And yet, as you say, is it?
What I would present it as a question instead of a statement.
Yeah.
Is the Constitution sacred? Is the Capitol sacred? Are these places, are these sacred spaces? And I would leave that as an open question, because
Mm.
to me, and I cannot help but do this whenever I recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I always make the sign of the cross. And the thing is, and I cannot help it, for it's a habit. And I guess I want them to be sacred. I'm a wannabe Sorkinite. I want to believe. And in a sense, whether or not I do believe, this is my community. And it falls to me as a Christian to seek what is best for my community. And that to me is what patriotism means. Whether the state that exists over the community is called the United States, or whether the state is something different, it falls to me to seek what is best for my community. That's my duty, if you will. But I want to believe. I want to hold these things sacred. I desperately want to.
So. Do you want to hold these truths to be self-evident? That
I do.
All men are created equal.
I do hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal.
Yeah.
But I don't think you have to be an American to do that.
Even though we've not lived up to that.
Absolutely. In fact, it might help not to be an American to hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal. So if you were preaching a sermon on this, what would the takeaway be for the congregation?
I think I would talk about this idea of being careful about what we hold in too high of an esteem. I would talk about that line between the political and the religious, and where they intersect or not, or should intersect or not. I would probably use the scripture that I mentioned about the Israelites. What does it mean? What does it mean to exercise leadership? What does God call of us to be as leaders? Because I've thought a lot about that in my role as a pastor. What does it mean to be a spiritual leader of a congregation, or to be in this role that I do have those eyes on me, and I have to, and I choose to honor that so as not to diminish the role for others, and yet to be who I am authentically. Damn
it, Pastor Michelle, you stole my sermon. No, I would have done something very similar. I think I talk about patriotism, and because I think it's an open question whether or not Christians can be patriots. I'd like to think so, but I'm not sure. And I would like to talk about icons in mythology, and the idea of how they play and interact with each other, and how we live into the myth of what it means to be a quote unquote American, for better and worse. So, and how that impacts our faith. And the last thing I'll say is by our identity as Christians means that we are citizens of a new state, of a new nation called the kingdom of God. And so what is it? The Lord says you cannot serve God and mammon. Mm-hmm. You cannot serve two masters. So does the act of calling ourselves American Christians means that we're trying to serve two masters? Answer, I don't know. I'd like to think not, but I don't know. So.
Yeah. So. All right. So the next movie that we are looking at is another audience pick called Court Jester, which I have not seen before.
Neither have I.
So I look forward to hearing that, and we'll see if we can get the person who suggested it for us. They may decide not to, but we'll see. Hopefully they will. But otherwise, we are so grateful for you to join us today. By the way, audience, thank you for bearing with me today as I am still dealing with the effects of this lovely little virus we call coronavirus 19. Just a reminder to take care of yourselves, get your vaccines, do everything you can to stay as healthy as you can for yourself and others.
Thank you for joining us on A Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater. Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater is a production of New Faith, New Media. If you've liked what you've heard here, please check out NFNM's other podcast, Faith in What Resonates, hosted by Gail Gallagher, and Breaking Fast with Saint Sparklebear. If you really like what you've heard, please like the New Faith, New Media page on Facebook. Consider becoming a Patreon of NFNM at www.patreon.com/NFNM and check out our website. Pastor Michelle, what was the website URL again?
newfaithnewmedia.net.
That one. Patrons get access to our private comedy roundtable show, Blessed Lunatics, in which the hosts of both podcasts, along with editor Wesley, riff on a variety of subjects and seek to access the divine through laughter. We'll see you next time when a pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater. All right, what's next?